In the end, I think that a Christian's perspective actually fits science better than an atheist. And that may surprise a lot of people to say that because they view science sometimes as an enemy to the faith. But there are actually some connections that make a lot more sense. Some examples include just the fact that the universe has a beginning. This is a scientific result, but it actually comes out of Genesis, right? That the universe had a beginning. That's where an example where science and faith resonate completely. Faith, confirms that, it excites it, it resonates with that discovery. So I wouldn't put it as a barrier to pursuing science. To me, it's a reason to.
Well, our guest today on the podcast is Dr. Brian Turner. He's a math and science professor here at Oklahoma Wesleyan. Dr. Turner, welcome to the show today. Excited to have you on. Thanks for taking some time. So you and I were talking before we got started that you've been at OKWU now for 25 years, which is hard to believe because you were here when I was a student, right? So talk to us a little bit just to get started today about your role here at Oklahoma Wesleyan and what it is that provides you with so much fulfillment being here for 25 years.
Yeah, that's quite a number that I can't really believe myself. And I've actually had, in fact, I have one this semester. I've actually have children of students I've taught. So it's kind of a sobering fact. But yeah, it's fun to be part of a legacy like that. This past weekend at homecoming, I saw several of my early students and had a good time reminiscing about the times we had. So yeah.
Yeah, good. So when we talk about, I mean, you and I were even talking about some of the stories that you've had of students that who may now be even parents and they come back. So are there any stories in particular of students that you've worked with that you've kind of seen their path and if so, talk to us a little bit about the role that maybe you played in their time here at Oklahoma Wesleyan.
Okay. Well, hopefully there's lots of students that I've kind of impacted in some way. The one that comes to my mind immediately is kind of a math prodigy I had about 10 years ago, Rebecca. And she could have accomplished anything. And so she went on to get her master's in math and was trying to decide what to do next. And she considered getting a PhD and even teaching adjunct for us. And she'd done a little bit of high school work too, and thought about teaching high school. And so we had a conversation, and the question I really posed for her was, where would you make the most difference? Kind of simplified it down to just that idea. And she thought, well, go teach high school. So she went to teach at Union High School. And so fast forward now, this year she's actually the national teacher of the year.
Wow,
So
yeah.
she's making an impact in ways that we had no idea. But it started with just that simple question: how do I make the most difference?
Yeah. Yeah. So for you, obviously you've got a PhD in relativity and a background in science. And so there's a lot of things that you could have done, right, with your research and your expertise. What is it about the field of education and higher education that drew you in and has kept you in this field and at the school for several years now?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good thing for me to reminisce a lot about because it was kind of a defining moment for me. And as you know, in your job, a lot of times students just don't know where they're headed or what career to pursue. And that was probably the case for me. And in graduate school, um, I didn't quite know. And so, probably 2 years left of research, I got a call from my alma mater, and they were looking for someone to fill in just for a short time. But when I thought about it, I said, there's no way I can do that because I've got to finish all this research as a full time job. Then you're asking me to teach full time as a rookie, and I would have to commute 5 hours both ways. And it just didn't really make sense. And a friend of mine had this conversation that kind of like I had with Rebecca that, asked me, well, where would you make the most difference? And I thought, well, probably teaching. And they said, well, that's what you should do. It was that simple and that crystallized. And that's the direction I went. And when I look back, it was kind of a miraculous time in my life because I talked about all those hours. If you do it on paper, there's no way you can get all of those things done. But somehow, looking back, it happened
Yeah.
and led me on the path I am now. And then
Yeah.
25 years later, here we are doing a podcast.
That's incredible. And we could talk about story, or I could talk about story after story of students who have been influenced you. And I love that response of where can you make the biggest difference? Because I think in our day and age with our culture, a lot of the times the question is where can I make the most money, or where can but
Get
the
the most
question
hits
exactly,
online.
right? The
Yeah.
most clicks, whatever.
Yeah.
And but I love that you foster an environment in your classroom and with your students to keep that question in front of where can I make the biggest difference, because that's what ultimately matters long term, right?
Sure.
So let's get into your journey a little bit. Just the math and science. So when did you first get interested in the fields of math and science? Kind of walk us back through that journey for you of where it all started for Dr.
Wow.
Brian Turner. Yeah, we'll go way back.
Well, if you want to go all the way back, I was born the year that astronauts walked on the moon. My middle name is Neil, believe it or not, for that
Because of
reason.
Neil Armstrong?
Yeah. So,
It was
and my
destined.
mom, yeah, so I'm an old guy. So, but my mom would has commented I wanted to be a moon man. That's what I called it back as a kid. But probably I haven't probably thought of all sorts of directions. I kind of have an artistic side, so I thought about being a cartoonist, writer, whatever. But my counselors and teachers recognized my skills in math and science. So they really actually guided me in that direction. And when I went to college, when I started college, I probably would have picked being an engineer as probably my choice. But as you know, students don't know. And for me, eventually, by people mentoring me, and it kind of ended up here in higher education.
Okay. Okay. I love that. So when you think about the field of science in particular, what is it that fascinates you about science? And more specifically, how have you seen the supernatural, or how have you seen evidence of God or God show up in your own journey through the world of science?
Wow, that's a great question. We could spend a lot of time really talking about that.
We can camp out there
Uh,
for a couple minutes.
but what kind of a fun aspect of my job is I get to look at both how God speaks to us through the Bible and also through nature. And Galileo, he quoted a few centuries ago that God gave us two books. He gave us the Bible and he gave us nature. They both can reveal truth about himself. So in a way, I have kind of a unique position. I get to explore both of those in a lot of detail. And there are certain ways that they overlap, which are kind of fun, which I try to do in my classes. One that you know about is talk about higher dimensions.
Yeah, can you give us an example, if you don't mind, just on what that has looked like for you, and some exploring side? Because
It's
you and I have had this conversation,
yeah.
but I think
Well, it's
our
a fun
audience would. Yeah.
conversation. Well, the idea that I borrow from is actually due to a priest. His name's Edwin Abbott, about 100 years ago. But he just had this clever idea. If I want to understand God and his higher dimensions, one way to do it is to look at the lower dimensions, how those are all connected, how I relate to those. And when you kind of understand how those work, then you go back out and think, well, this is how God relates to my dimensions. And you get a real good handle of how a higher being could relate to this, relate to us. As um, you also get a feel for how certain miracles could happen,
Sure.
how God can see the future. So all these things you get a real handle just by exploring kind of this mathematical idea of dimensions. Probably the most important idea is that it's totally logically consistent for a higher dimensional being to be able to relate and interact with us, but also be apart from us, be invisible to us. It makes total logical sense out of that.
Okay, so then that gets back into the dimensions that you were talking about, right? So
Sure.
so you obviously are a man of faith, obviously, and you bring that into your classroom quite a bit. So for you, how do you use science as a way to learn about God in the classroom with the students that you're working with? How do you facilitate those kinds of conversations where science teaches us about God and his creativity?
Well, I think you try to find some of those intersection points. We talked about higher dimensions. That's kind of a way to do it. Um, Free will. There's a connection with quantum mechanics, things like that. Probably the most obvious one is the creation account, right? How do you make what we see in Genesis match with what we
Hmm.
see in science? And although science, I mean, the Bible is not a science textbook, so you have to be careful with it. But there are some definite connections, I think, that you see spell out of that. An example I like is from Genesis 1 is the word said. God said, "Let there be light."
Hmm.
I think that's probably the most underrated word in the creation story because it describes how God relates to us. It's not that he blinked it or spoke it, or he did speak it. He didn't snap it. He spoke it. He had to use a language to communicate to nature itself. You see a similar idea in Jesus when he calmed the storm. He spoke to the wind and the waves. He used this language, used words to communicate his power. And so when I look at something like that from a scientific viewpoint, can you find evidence that God used language? And in fact, you do. Scientists have known for a long time that mathematics is the best way to describe nature. It's a language. It's like someone spoke these symbols and syntax and grammar all into this beautiful idea. And then there's other layers to that. If you look at chemistry, what do you remember about your high school chemistry? There's a big chart at the front of the room that looks like an alphabet.
Yeah.
And you make the substances of the world out of combining those letters to make words, in a sense.
Yeah.
A final layer is just our DNA. If you really think about our DNA, it's a 3 billion letter long word, and what makes my word different from yours is just a few different letters in different places.
Yeah.
So to me, that's just so striking that if you look at nature from a scientist, you see evidence of an underlying language. It's the best way to understand nature, and Genesis 1 tells you that that's how God made it happen.
Yeah.
It's just so compelling.
You see, it's like you see the fingerprints of the divine of God all over these different areas of creation, right? When you start to connect the dots of all of them, you can't help but recognize God's creative capacity and the way that He continues to speak and create, which is really, 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 really neat. So, uh,
Absolutely. And that's an example of where the Bible can intersect with your subject of science.
sure,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's part of what makes you unique is the classroom is your parish, right? And in the fields of math and science are the language that you use to kind of explore and help students understand that. So let's get into a little bit more of the teaching side for you in the classroom space. So when you think about your approach to the classroom, and I know you're someone who continues to refine and develop and create, what kind of atmosphere would you say that you're trying to create in the classroom? And maybe give us an example or two of how you go about doing that.
Yeah. I mean, everybody has their own teaching philosophy. I would say the important ones for me, I think about is one, relational. You want to try to be as relational as you can. So the first assignment of classes is often to come in for an interview. So you try right from the start to build those relationships and continue on the way through. I also want to make it very interactive, very hands-on. You don't want to just uh, share information, but you want to have see them work it out in real life. So people who know me know that we build boats to sail around the campus out of basically duct tape. We will have a medieval weapon with we build trebuchets and shoot golf balls. Another one that was well known for a while was I have them build these burglar alarms, and then I would set them out all over my house and allow them to try to outwit all the alarms. So these are things where they immerse themselves in some fun activity where science is not just on paper, but tries to come to life.
Yeah. Yeah. So anything like with the students, because you used to have students, you don't do it anymore because you're married now, but students that would break into your house, and I'm sure your wife probably wouldn't appreciate students trying to break into your house.
No, that was the
But
end of that
yeah,
activity.
but tell
Yes.
us more about it. I mean, what was that about? What was the goal of it? And any stories along with that that were kind of interesting or, things that happen? Because I know you've had students that, for whatever reason, things happen, so tell us a little bit about that as far as students trying to break into Dr. Turner's house.
Yeah. Well, you are correct. That ended once I got married. Although I did do the mansion for a little while. But the idea was, I think, inspired by a kind of a nerdy movie I saw. But these teams had built these security devices, the pressure or heat or sound alarms or whatever. So I built a sort of a challenge to put these all over my house, and they had to enter into my house, avoid setting them all off, get what the prize was, and get back out. And they had like an hour to do that. And so they come over with flashlights and camouflage paint, trying to do it in a stealthful way.
Which I'm sure your neighbors appreciated for
Well,
quite a bit.
that leads me to
Okay.
the idea that's talked about is one year my neighbors saw all the lights off next door and a bunch of flashlights going on. And they looked at their own house and said, "Well, our power's not out. Why is his power out? So their conclusion was there must be
Oh, no.
some burglars next door. So they notified the police, called the police, and so fortunately, I was out on the porch. I was out of the house watching them do it, and so I saw one cop come around one side, another cop came around the other, a third one came around. Basically, a SWAT team had surrounded my house, and fortunately, I was there to stop them from going in and discovering all these students crawling around my floor.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's
so that was certainly a year to remember, an
uh-huh,
event to remember.
uh-huh.
Yeah,
When you think about your classes, why do you think students enjoy? Because I mean, I talk to students all the time. I'm on a wait list for Dr. Turner's class. I want to get in. Why do you, what is it about your classes that you think students enjoy? Because the reality is, a lot of times students aren't clamoring to get into math and science classes, right? Regardless of their major.
sure.
But that's not the case with you. So what is it about your classes, Brian, that you feel like students really enjoy or that they look forward to coming to class with Dr. Turner?
Well, I think we've kind of hit on some of the main ingredients. You're right. It does surprise me that sometimes my class is their favorite, even though they don't do well, even though I don't get a good grade, they still feel like it's a positive experience. And it's that relational style. I try to become best friends, as good friends I can with them. It's the fun activities that try to make science come alive. And even some of them are drawn to being challenged spiritually. And so I think all of those and maybe other things make it worthwhile for
Yeah,
them.
an incredible combination, that dynamic of the human relationships, right? The field that you're talking about, but that faith element too. And I think when students, when they can engage in a context like that, I mean, that can make all the difference in the world for students in creating kind of a vibrant learning community. Uh, um, so as you think about your classes and the things that you teach on, in the fields of math and science, are there concepts that you find yourself continuing to come back to that are particularly meaningful for the students that you're working with? I mean, in the field of math and science, right? Are there concepts that you keep coming back to that you feel like make a difference, or do you see kind of the light bulb go off for students with certain things?
I think we've touched on some of them, I guess. So the ones that really, like higher dimensions or looking at creation account differently, those kind of are can become light bulb moments where they think about something that they never thought before. So I think that's a key. I also try to do some ethical considerations too. I don't want to leave that out and just talk about the science, but what are ways that we need to think about how we're using our current technology? So that's, in fact, physical science. That's their last major assignment is to do an ethics project, explore some technology and see what is the good and the bad. So you're trying to develop wisdom in that way too. For our majors, we have an entire class devoted to that, where they explore some of the technological issues and the ethics involved. So
Okay.
that's important too.
I want to drill down on that for just for a minute. So can you give us an example of maybe something out there in the field that the ethical implications are significant? So when you talk to students about it, being aware of the morality of it, can you give us an example of one of those things might be for you?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. In fact, I almost feel sorry for students because they have so many different ethical issues to think about. The obvious ones are CRISPR, where we're now almost to the point where we can edit human being. If we make the choice, we can edit somebody's DNA. So do we really want to be designing our own offspring? That's a huge question. AI is another one that's probably emerging. We're just about to the point where we can create an opponent. If AI or these machines ever decide that we're its enemy, and we haven't wisely put in safeguards, we could be in big trouble. But the list really goes on, and
Yeah,
we have quite a lot to think about.
sure. And that kind of leads me to my next question. When you think about the field of science in the future, are there any scientific breakthroughs or things coming down the pipe that you think have particular or can have a particular impact on what it means to be human, or our sense of morality or ethics? Anything out there? I mean, we talked about CRISPR gene editing, but anything else out there on the horizon that you think has significant implications for morality in life as human beings?
Well, I think I probably mentioned the two that would probably be my list. I think AI has an ability to transform um, what it means to be human too, and because it's going to transform all of our jobs. And in fact, teaching itself is even as we speak, is being transformed by AI since we have access to all those things. So, our role of work, our role of how we're going to make a difference, where do we fit in the society, the whole fabric of it. What happens when AI can do all of our jobs better than us? It's really going to change the landscape. So to me, that's probably a big one to keep an eye on.
Okay. And I know, a lot of us, AI might be something that we would consider to be neutral in the sense of morality. So what is the particular danger, or maybe not danger is too strong of a word? What do we need to be aware of in the whole field of AI that you think has significant implications for the way that we think or the way that we work? Where does it become dangerous, in your opinion?
Great question. I guess I've kind of touched on it maybe a little bit. Um, it's going to change everybody's job, and it's going to change all the aspects that make us human. I mean, what makes us human is our creativity. I mean, being in God's image. He was creative. He's made us creative. Well, what happens when you make machines that can be more creative than we are in a sense because they can try more versions of something than we can possibly do. So it's going to change what creativity means. We have the value that comes from our work. Well, it's going to change what work means. So yeah, so it's going to affect those ideas of how humanity works. Where it becomes dangerous, is we've we've put all these different pieces together. We're talking about, we're all connected by our phones. Cameras can identify us, recognize us. We have drones that can become weapons. So now, if we throw in a brain that can calculate and compute and make decisions faster than us, if it decides, you know, that we're its opponent, we're going to be in big trouble.
One of the things that we've seen is the impression that people of faith have exited the field of science, right? So there's sometimes this binary relationship between faith and science. Why do you think it's so important for people of faith to be faithful, or why is it so important for faithful followers to be present in the field of science, right? So a lot of times people of faith tend to say, I don't belong in the world of math and science. It doesn't really, have implications for as far as my faith. How would you refute that? Why is it important for people of faith to be involved in the fields of math and science?
Well, the practical reason, I guess, is just as we develop these technologies and we're deciding the direction that these technologies go, you definitely want moral thinking people to be making those decisions. So that's the very practical reason. I think maybe the more deeper reason is that you find that there really are some connections. We've talked about those already. And I think in the end, I think that a Christian's perspective actually fits science better than an atheist. And that may surprise a lot of people to say that because they view science sometimes as an enemy to the faith. But there are actually some connections that make a lot more sense for science to be viewed from a Christian viewpoint. Um, some examples include just the fact that the universe has a beginning. This is a scientific result, but it actually comes out of Genesis, right? That the universe had a beginning. That's where an example of where science and faith resonate completely. And my view of faith, confirms that. It excites it. It resonates with that discovery. So I wouldn't put it as a barrier to pursuing science. To me, it's a reason to do science. In fact, if you look at the founders of modern science, they are in fact Christians, people of deep faith who realize that the universe must make sense because the God who made it is rational.
Yeah. Yeah. If we could explore that just for a minute. I know you and I have talked about Einstein a little bit, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but Einstein would be one of those people who through the field of math and science, I don't know that he would have called himself a Christian, right? But certainly he
No.
became a deist from what I understand. Is that correct? So what did that look like for him? I mean, what was it about his discovery in math and science, even the beginning of the universe itself, that led him to a path to at least acknowledge some sort of creative being that he came to believe that, correct?
Well, he was of Jewish origin. he would not call himself a Christian, or he would not describe as having a relationship with God. But he did speak in a language that there is something beyond us. Um, and the clues, some of the clues, he always wondered why the universe is comprehensible to start with. You know, this famous quote: "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe that is comprehensible." Well, if you think about that, the reason that it is comprehensible is becomes from an intelligent source behind it all. And so Einstein would kind of use that language. He would use God in some of his statements. Not that he went to church every week, but he knew that there was something out there beyond us
The universe wasn't just
that held it all
random. Yeah.
together. Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Good. So, after teaching for so many years, what are some important things that you've learned? I mean, obviously, you spend so much of your time pouring into the lives of students and helping them journey as they're asking their own questions. What are some things that you've learned as a professor, as a teacher,
Regarding science or life
regarding
or
science, regarding the lives of students, regarding your own faith journey?
um wow, that's a great question too. I mean, we certainly uh, always growing, always learning. In fact, we want to try to create lifelong learners in whatever subject. I One of the favorite classes I teach is astronomy because it's always changing. Every day is a new discovery. And I was talking with someone just a few minutes ago that we look at this page that every day produces a new astronomy page. It's called the APOD. But every day it's a new image, it's a new discovery, it's expanding what we know. And so it's always living, always present. So that's exciting. The learning process is never over. As far as a personal level, um, I get hopefully I've grown that way too. I think you grow a level of humility of realizing that you don't know everything and that it's okay to say no and admit you don't know everything and make mistakes. And hopefully students see that that makes you more relatable, that they understand that yeah, you're still learning too.
Yeah. Yeah. You brought up the whole field of astronomy and kind of, coming full circle in our conversation. I know you've done a lot of thought about the James Webb telescope that was launched. When was that launched? A couple years ago, right? This With the Webb telescope, has there been any discoveries made that you have found particularly interesting through this telescope as it continues to capture some of the images of God's creativity in the universe?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a beautiful new tool, and anytime science gets a new tool, it's always fun to see what's out there. In some sense, it's kind of refining what we already knew. The Hubble telescope is really what revolutionized our view of the universe. So it's adding more and more depth to that, more precision to that in terms of how many galaxies there are, how big the universe actually is. So it kind of opens up and help us make better measurements of that. And the big questions now in astronomy are, how big is the universe? How fast is it expanding? Because that's going to lead to its ultimate fate. Believe it or not, the most of the universe is made of something we don't really know what it is. We call it dark matter. That's just kind of a word we invented because we don't know what it is. So believe it or not, most of the universe we don't know what it is. And so these are deep space discoveries that the web might help us find. And the one that everybody's interested in is there life out there? And our astronomy tools are just about to the point where we can identify which planets out there that would be habitable, and also some of the chemicals and substances that either life needs or life produces. So believe it or not, we're just on the edge of that level of discovery. And so that's exciting to me.
Yeah. When we talk about the size of the universe, it's easy to kind of stick to our own bubble, like get our little microscopic bubble here on planet Earth. But what kind of scope or size are we talking about on this level?
Wow, it's pretty much unimaginable, the scale of anything beyond ourselves. And even if you just play around with our own local neighborhood, if I'm a nickel on this table, where's the next closest star? It's in Oklahoma City.
Wow.
So and that's just the closest star. And then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then you not just have our solar system that's within our galaxy, then you have galaxies beyond our own galaxies, which Edwin Hubble discovered in the early 20th century. And now, as we add these new instruments like the Webb telescope, they allow us to see further and further, which means we're seeing further and further back in time. So yeah, how big is the universe? There's really no way to comprehend that.
Yeah, it's big.
It's at least, and we'll never know how big it is because we can't see beyond a point where light has had time to get to us. So there's an edge to that we can't ever see beyond. So these numbers we give are only just what we can see. So it's yeah.
Yeah. And I think, coming full circle then in our conversation, part of it then is when we look at the scope, the bigness of the universe, right? And we read the Genesis narrative about God creating these by speaking, and yet we also look at the smallness when we talk about gene editing, and we talk about DNA, and we talk about those things that make you uniquely you and me uniquely me, and that God is the author and the architect behind all of that. It gives you a whole new level of appreciation for the expanse, the creativity, but also the kindness of the Lord, who in His infinite creativity created us, man and woman, to inhabit and to take part in the creation, which is unbelievable to think about, crazy to think about.
Yeah, that's a great way to bring it full circle. And getting back to the idea that God spoke, it conveys that God is trying to have a relationship too, right? I'm not just making it happen, but I want to have a conversation with what I'm creating. And so in spite of the amazing universe he's created, he wants to speak to me as part of his creation. That's just unimaginable.
Yeah, as unimaginable as the scope of the universe, that's even more unimaginable. That the author and architect who created all of this has designed us for a personal relationship with him is just something that's just hard to get over, hard to fathom, but incredible. Yeah.
Exactly.
So when you think about the future and for you, and you think about the group of students that you're working with right now, um, what is it that you see in them that makes you believe in them? And then I'll follow up that with what is it that gives you hope for the future?
All right, another great question. Some days you look at your students, you say, "Boy, we're in big trouble." But overall, you look at them and um, you see the creativity. If we're going to solve problems, that's going to take some creativity. We're going to have people think of things we haven't thought of before, and so you see that within them. I love being with students because they have the sense of humor. We're going to need that too because there's lots of problems out there. But you're keeping this, you know, optimistic, humorous approach, we're going to need that as well. And there really is, even though you may not think it, there really is a searching among our students. They want to know, they want to see the truth, and they want to feel like they have meaning. Where's my significance? So they're searching these deep questions that lead you in the right direction. And
Yeah.
so that's something to be excited
I love
about.
that. I love that. So one of the things you mentioned is humor for you, and I know you well enough that you try to bring humor sometimes into the classroom. Can you get any examples of how you've been able to kind of bring humor in? This was a while ago, but we do an event here on campus called Late Night Breakfast, and I remember several years ago. You don't do this anymore, but the Jimmy Fallon, the thank you notes that you would do, like you would kind of do your own OKWU unique thank you notes. But how do you bring humor into the classroom? And a secondary question, which might be a challenge to answer, in your scientific research and discovery, are there any fingerprints of what I would call the humor of God that you think He's kind of placed in, right? Maybe a cosmic joke that God has imprinted on the universe just as part of His own creative humor.
You mean besides just you and me
Yeah,
as
yeah,
his expression?
yeah,
Well, I think a lot of great presenters know the fact that humor is a way to connect with people. And if you can make someone laugh and cry in the same presentation, then you're really opening up their emotions to make a point, to make a difference. And so I try to approach when I speak in chapel, which I do. I usually make fun of the baseball team; they're one of my main targets. But you just try to open up their emotions by appealing to their sense of humor, and then that allows you to make some deeper, more serious points. So I recommend that for anyone. So yeah, this shows up in our chapel presentations. different lectures. So yeah, it makes a
It's
difference.
great. Great. Good. Well, thank you, Brian, for being on the show today. I really appreciate the continued investment that you're making in this next generation of mathematicians and scientists and world leaders, because we know you've got students from all sorts of backgrounds that are studying for ministry or education, and they are better people for being in your classroom. So thank you for what you do for us in this next generation of leaders.